Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me today. I think it's safe to say that the majority of us here at the Games for Change Festival do not need to be convinced that games are a great way to learn. But I do want us to consider another perspective that's still held by some individuals. I'm going to discuss why some future teachers don't want to use games in the classroom. I'm a teacher that does not need to be convinced. I've wanted to play video games in school ever since I was young. But of course, early on, I was a fan mainly because of the entertainment and social aspects of the experience. Later on, I would eventually learn about the theories and research evidence that supports the use of video games for learning. But my interest mainly starts with the great memories of the different gaming systems that were around when I was growing up. I still remember how curious and excited I was when I first played the Intellivision video game system at my friend's house. I can also easily recall the many times my brother and I played King's Quest on the IBM PC Junior that my dad had bought for us. And some of you might still remember the Nintendo versus Sega era with the classic Genesis commercial. My friends and I used to get into many serious debates about these two systems back then. I wish I could go back and just observe how passionately we would argue about whether the technical specs of each system were more important than the different gaming libraries they each offered. These were great times as we watched the 8-bit games be replaced by 16-bit games, and then eventually 32-bit games and so on. It seemed like there was no limit to how much the graphics could improve. But one thing I can also remember from my earliest years during this time period is that computers used to sit in the back of some of my classrooms. Educational games existed during this time, but they just never seemed to be a part of my classroom experiences. I can't say for certain why I never played games like Oregon Trail in school, but what I can say for sure is that I was always glancing at the computers in the back of my classrooms, wondering when we would be able to use them. My interest in video games and computers influenced my choice to eventually pursue engineering and digital design degrees. As the years passed, the educational value of games continued to be promoted, and more people began recognizing them. So the kid in me that had always wondered why video games weren't being used in my classrooms was excited and thinking about the ways he might be able to participate in the creation of these games. As was the case before, the technology just kept getting better, and with my engineering and graphics background, I had knowledge about the behind-the-scenes magic that powered the games I enjoyed. Even university programs were recognizing the educational value of games. I complemented my engineering and digital design knowledge with a doctorate in instructional technology and media. Those educational experiences made it possible for me to spend part of my professional career as an online game programmer for Sesame Workshop. Fast forward to today, and I'm now a professor and researcher at the UC Davis School of Education. I teach future educators about how video games and other media can be used in classrooms. In my courses, students learn about the health benefits and educational benefits of video games. We read graphic novels about video games and computer programming. We watch videos and listen to podcasts from researchers and teachers who share their experiences with games. We also play different video games inside and outside of the class. Yet despite learning quite a bit about how games can be used in schools, many of my students are still unsure if they'll use games in their future classrooms. Research shows that my students' experiences and feelings around video games, technologies, and schooling are pretty consistent with that of other aspiring teachers in the US and abroad. For example, studies have shown that future teachers do not play video games as often as other students. This is important because it's one of the reasons why they are less comfortable with video games. In another study of US teachers, it was found that more than half of the participants surveyed reported that they do not nor do they intend to use games in their classrooms. A more recent research article offered findings from a survey of German teachers that found that even when they held positive beliefs about educational video games, teachers rarely incorporated them into their lessons. So I decided to examine my own students' perspectives about games in schools by designing a study that explores how their thoughts have evolved since completing my class, graduating, and then teaching in their own classrooms. I'll continue now by sharing some of the main reasons why many are still hesitant to use games in their classrooms. Afterward, I'll share suggestions for how we can address their concerns moving forward. So despite all of the existing evidence about the instructional benefits of video games, and regardless of the multiple examples of positive video game content we discussed and engaged with in my class, my students were still largely influenced by the same concerns many other people have about games. They believe that video games promote negative behaviors and values. For example, Natalia pointed to her experiences while playing Forge of Empires, one of the games we played in my class. Forge of Empires is a browser-based strategy game, and the official website explains that you can build your own city and experience all of history from its perspective from the Stone Age on through the centuries. So players begin in the year 5000 BC, and they progress through time into the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age, and so on. But Natalia feels that games like Forge of Empires promote bad behavior. She states that more powerful players often invaded her village to steal her resources. Here is one quote from her. "I was just sitting there innocently, minding my own business, and then I'd log on, and someone thought it was okay to just take my things that I had worked hard on. That's sad, because then I went to look at their city, and it was ginormous. And I'm like, you don't need more resources from little old me. The rich stealing from the poor." Game addiction was also a concern that Natalia brought up during her interview. She shared the following. "I just don't like video games, or maybe I like them too much that I wanted to spend so much time on it. There you could make so little progress each day, and you just had to keep coming back because that's how they get you. That's how capitalism works. Like, well, you can come back in 16 hours, or you can pay us money and you can get ahead faster. And that's just how life works, so it's a promotion of values that I just fundamentally disagree with." Another research participant, Heather, shared her concerns about the violence displayed in most games, as well as the sexist depictions of women in video games. Heather states, if they're not specifically geared towards women, if they're not specifically geared towards kids, there's just a lot of violence and like really bad ways of representing women, especially in their clothing. And it just makes me feel really uncomfortable to look at these games because I just feel like that's not something that I want to support. When there's a lot of people shooting at each other, it just feels really insulting to have women dressed in really revealing clothes. Why would you design women characters to look like that? Why can't they just wear more normal clothes? So Heather understands that violence and these portrayals of women will most likely not be a problem that teachers and parents have to worry about when students play educational games. But she's concerned about how educational games might serve as a sort of gateway drug to the sorts of games that she doesn't want them to play. She states, "I don't want to create opportunities for people to play bad games. Yes, there are good games and bad games for sure, but letting those kids play the good games in class means you're also giving them that laptop that can access the bad games. So just because you're only promoting the good games, it doesn't mean they're only going to stay in that area." So Heather believes that students need to be shielded from any risk that might come from having access to negative games. So in the second quote she shares, "They're definitely going to be influenced by what this game is trying to present. And if it's so much focused on these values that I just don't cherish, then it just makes me feel like it's not worth encouraging the use of video games in schools." Lack of diversity and representation was also a major concern. This was an immediate issue that came up with some of my participants. For example, The Forge of Empires game claims that you can experience all of history from the perspective of your city, but that's not exactly true because the game's narrative is told only from a European perspective, and that's not all of history. Research participant Eileen commented on what she felt was a lack of diversity at the start of the game when she was looking through its 141 avatar choices. Eileen stated, "I found that there were only 2 female avatars that had a dark enough skin complexion paired with curly looking hair that I could choose from to be an accurate representation of me." Another participant, Mina, also complained about the avatar choices at the start of the game. She stated, "Forge of Empires automatically gave me a man as an avatar, and when I had the chance to edit it, the choices were mostly white males." So Mina was especially worried about these experiences because she thought it might encourage others to believe that girls cannot play video games. Another student, Kurt, also commented on what he felt were flaws in the avatar selections. He reflected on the excuses he's often heard. So here Kurt says, "The common argument for this sort of racial homogeneity in semi-historical fantasy worlds is that they are set in medieval Europe. But in this case, going throughout all of human history in an unnamed location, that is a clearly ridiculous argument." So the reasons I've shared so far are just a few examples from teachers that are often also shared by some of the general public. The next few examples I'll share are unique to teachers. We'll enter into their classrooms as they give us more reasons why they still aren't comfortable with using video games. These reasons will consider some ways video games appear to be incompatible with their teaching methods. So Kurt was especially concerned about classroom management and ensuring that students were learning. He says, "The number one reason would be because they're kind of hard to police, and they can be very distracting. You don't know when a student is playing video games if they're actually getting any educational value out of it, especially if they're just breezing through it easy." Kurt also comments on instances when the students themselves are reluctant to play video games in class. He says, "If the video game is supposed to be fun and they don't enjoy it, they oftentimes will just refuse to do it." Excuse me. So Aaron shares in the confusion over whether students are actively engaged in learning while playing video games, and the source of his confusion comes from his disbelief in the ability of a game to successfully provide all of the necessary instruction. He understands that there have been excellent examples discussed in class, but he feels that those experiences cannot be replicated because he doesn't believe companies and educational institutions will be financially motivated to create and use high-quality educational games. Aaron asks, "How do we integrate all that knowledge into the game? Like, who's going to do it? Because it costs money, and I don't know if schools have enough money to really buy the game or pay for the game or develop the game." Aaron strongly believes that the success stories that are promoted are idealistic goals that can't be achieved without manufactured support systems. He doesn't believe this is possible in real school context because he hasn't seen it in his own schools. The other teachers around him are not using video games, and Aaron says this is because we don't know enough about it. It's not established. The effort and preparation required to successfully instruct students with video games is intimidating to many teachers. Eileen remarks that many teachers prefer to stick to a traditional instructional approach because it's just easier and faster to teach a lesson this way than to make a game out of it. Aaron agrees and comments, "I still think games take a lot longer to learn and teach than just lecturing for 1 hour and having students go home and study." Teachers also feel restricted by the digital medium and do not view it as a space where learning can naturally occur. Aaron remarks, "When it comes to math and stuff, I still think you need that pen and paper to really get that practice in for exams." Kurt also referenced math. He offered a lesson he gave his high school students on angle addition postulate as an example. Kurt stated, "I actually think the only way you could possibly even fit it into a video game is if you made it very explicitly about angle addition postulate or geometry. I guess in general, maybe there are more creative people other than me that would know how to do it, but I wouldn't know how to actually fit that lesson into a video game." My participants also reflect on the hardware that's required for video games, and they worry about the outmoded technologies in their school settings and the students' homes. Kurt comments, "There are varying levels of complexity with just handling the latest technologies, and students have varying levels of experience with computers, especially in the more economically disadvantaged areas." Kurt elaborates further on this, and he shares, there are a surprising amount of students that just don't even have basic computer literacy. I think they might struggle with trying to control a video game, and they might just struggle with the control so much that they would have difficulty actually getting through the game at all. So we've come to the end. Understanding some of the reasons behind the ongoing reluctance to use video games as educational resources can help us identify the aspects of teacher training that needs to be addressed. But that alone will not result in a future where video games are accepted as mainstream instructional resources. So I'll conclude now by sharing some suggestions on how we can move in that direction. We should continue teaching current and future teachers about practical and research-supported approaches to using video games in the classroom, but we also need to teach these topics in educational leadership programs that are targeted at principals and policymakers. Those who instruct these populations can respond to negative beliefs and attitudes about video games by engaging in meaningful dialogue with these educational professionals. These conversations can examine the pros and cons of existing school systems. They can also examine how our school systems and social values contribute to our negative beliefs about video games in classrooms. We should be honest about the wide range of positive and questionable video games that do exist, but we should not apply a protectionist approach to our students' media experiences. We should instead promote a critical media literacy approach so that students can develop the ability to critique the games for themselves. We also need more public promotions of great educational video games. These can come in the forms of broadcast television commercials, newspaper articles, and newspaper opinion pieces that promote the research evidence presented in academic journals about the value of educational video games. We should be publicly celebrating the educational video games that do exist, as well as the teams involved in their development. Thank you again for taking this time to hear about some of the reasons why some future teachers don't want to use games in their classrooms.